The Sleep Era. The Sleep Era.
Snow smothers the field, yet it cannot hide the horror. Bodies lie where they fell, stiff and locked in death's embrace. Some still clutch broken swords, others frozen mid-reach toward comrades who will never rise. The river below does not flow. It is choked with men, their armor dragging them under, their faces pale against the dark water. 28,000 lives ended in one day, for one crown. Brothers fought brothers here, not in some distant foreign land, but on their own soil. Men who once drank together at the same tables now lay torn open in the snow. And the wind, it carries no victory song, only the hollow howl of something that cannot be undone. But this slaughter did not begin in the snow. It began in whispered accusations, in court chambers where smiles masked daggers, in the quiet corrosion of loyalty. This war did not simply arrive. It grew like rot beneath the skin, unseen until it devoured the body whole. The blood at Towton was the final scream of a kingdom already broken from within, a scream so loud it echoed far beyond the battlefield. And to understand how England's heart froze that day, we must step back before the snow turned red. It did not start with armies, it started with bloodlines. Two branches from the same royal tree, Lancaster and York, each claiming the same crown as their rightful inheritance. To outsiders, it might seem like a quarrel over titles and protocol, but for England, this was the slow unmaking of its very heart. Henry VI sat on the throne, a king by birth but not by strength. His reign was marked by long silences, sudden withdrawals from public life, and moments when his mind drifted far from the matters of state. In the royal chambers, these lapses were whispered about with pity by some, and with calculation by others. A king who cannot hold the reins invites someone else to take them. Richard, Duke of York, had the bloodline, the military record, and the will to rule. He had fought for England and France, earned the loyalty of seasoned commanders, and carried himself with a confidence that the court could not ignore. His claim to the throne was not built on impulse. It was a carefully layered argument, one that began in legal petitions and ended in the private oaths of men who believed he should be king. But power in England did not rest on parchment alone. It lived in the spaces between people, in the alliances, marriages, and debts that bound nobles to one side or the other. And here, the queen herself became the sharpest blade. Margaret of Anjou was no silent consort. She was fierce, intelligent, and utterly unwilling to see her husband's line diminished. To her, Richard was not a guardian of the realm. He was a usurper in waiting. In the great halls of Westminster, tension seeped into every exchange. Banquets that once echoed with laughter became cold gatherings where eyes darted, weighing every word. A toast could mask a threat. A gift could hide a warning. Friends began to count their allies before speaking their minds. Even the servants felt the shift, repeating rumors with lowered voices as if the walls themselves might be listening. Across the kingdom, the divide deepened. In the markets, common folk argued over which rose to wear on their breast, red for Lancaster, white for York. On the training fields, men drilled harder, as if sharpening their steel could shield them from what was coming. The very air seemed heavier, as if England was holding its breath. The final spark would come not from the streets, but from the heart of the court. One accusation too sharp, one maneuver too bold, and the fragile peace would snap. It was no longer a question of if the crown would be fought over, but when, then, and when it came, it would consume the kingdom whole. And that when was already moving closer, carried in the footsteps of marching men, in banners that would soon be unfurled against the winter sky. When the Duke of York fell, his cause did not die, João. It found a sharper sword in his son. Edward was young, but he was not untested. Tall, charismatic, and decisive in a way his father had sometimes failed to be. He stepped into the vacuum left by Richard's death with a resolve that startled even his allies. To Edward, this was no longer a debate over succession. It was a matter of survival. If he did not seize the crown would destroy him. The killing of his father at Wakefield was more than a victory for Lancaster. It was a message sent in blood. Edward received it with cold clarity. This was not politics anymore. This was vengeance wrapped in the language of kingship. Every banner he raised, every letter he sent to rally support, carried that truth between the lines. But he was not the only one moving pieces on the board. Margaret of Anjou had tasted triumph, and she intended to turn it into a crushing blow. Her army swelled with hardened veterans and new recruits drawn by loyalty, fear, or the promise of spoils. To her, Edward was a boy playing at war, one she would break before he could even plant his feet. And yet, Edward understood something the Queen underestimated: the hunger of men for a leader who appeared born to rule. In the towns he passed, people spoke of his presence, his height, the way he carried himself as if the crown was already his. Soldiers who had once fought under his father now rode for him with a fervor sharpened by grief. Charisma was not just charm. In war, it was a weapon. Still, the risk was immense. Every step toward the throne meant marching directly into the teeth of the Queen's army. His claim to kingship rested not only on lineage, but on the outcome of the next battle. There would be no second chance. And in the bitter winter of 1461, the path forward led to a village called Towton, a place soon to be buried in snow and corpses. What would happen when Edward and Margaret finally met across the field? That answer would shape England for generations, but first their armies had to find each other. The roads to Towton were already grinding under the weight of men, horses, and iron. And as the two forces drew closer, the land itself seemed to brace for what was coming. War does not arrive like a sudden storm. It creeps forward, mile by mile, until the ground itself trembles beneath it. In the closing days of March 1461, England's roads carried two rivers of men, each flowing toward the same icy crossing point. Edward's Yorkist host moved from the south, hardened by recent victories, its banners snapping in the wind like the wings of predatory birds. From the north came Margaret's Lancaster army, vast and determined, a wall of red and steel that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The land between them had no choice in the matter. Villages along the way were stripped bare, their food and fuel claimed by whichever army arrived first. Farmers watched from doorways as soldiers trampled fields still wet from winter, their boots leaving dark scars in the snow. For the common folk, this was not a war of roses. It was a war of survival. Edward rode among his men, speaking little but watching everything. He knew morale could crack before swords even crossed. A hungry army is a dangerous army, dangerous to its enemy, but deadly to itself. He kept the pace steady, not rushing to meet the Queen's forces before his lines were ready to hold. Meanwhile, scouts brought word of the Lancaster position, entrenched on higher ground near Towton, their numbers bolstered by fresh reinforcements. Edward understood the danger, but he also knew he could not turn back. Every league marched was a step deeper into the promise he had made, that he would take the crown or die in the attempt. The weather began to change as both armies drew close. Clouds thickened and the wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp scent of snow. Veterans recognized the signs. A storm was coming. But for Edward, the storm was no longer just in the sky. It was in the pounding of hooves, the clash of iron against iron, as men tested their weapons, the grim silence of soldiers who understood what waited for them. Did they imagine the field they were marching toward would become the largest grave in England's history? Perhaps some did. Perhaps others pushed the thought away, focusing only on the warmth of their cloaks or the weight of their sword hilts. But the truth was walking beside them, step for step. By the time both armies reached Towton, the snow had begun to fall in earnest. Light at first, then heavier, swirling, carried by a wind that would soon decide the fate of kings. The first arrow vanished into the storm, and with it, the last chance for mercy. The wind tore across the field, driving snow into the faces of Lancaster's archers. They loosed their shafts blindly, the arrows curving back toward them as if the air itself had chosen a side. On the opposite slope, the Yorkist bowmen planted their feet, drew, and sent their reply. Their arrows did not drift. They flew straight, vanishing into the white curtain, then finding their mark with sickening precision. Men collapsed before they could even raise shields. Horses screamed and went down, crushing those beneath them. And still the snow thickened, swallowing the field until friend and foe became shifting shadows. In that blinding white, every figure could be your brother or your executioner. Edward's line advanced, boots crunching over frozen ground, their breath heavy in the cold. The clash came suddenly, steel against steel, the sharp ring cutting through the howl of the wind. Blood hit the snow in hot splashes that steamed before freezing. Men slipped in it, fell, and were swallowed by the press of bodies. Some fought with precision, others with desperation, hacking wildly just to keep the enemy from closing in. The snow, once clean, became a churned red sludge beneath their feet. Visibility was nothing. Men fought by sound, by the feel of the enemy's blades striking their own. This was not the glory sung of in ballads. This was survival in its rawest form. Hours passed, though no one could measure them. The sun, hidden behind the storm, gave no sense of time. All they knew was the weight in their arms, the taste of iron in their mouths, and the knowledge that stopping meant dying. And yet, even in the chaos, the tide began to shift. York's line pushed forward, inch by inch, driving Lancaster's men back toward the slope. It was not a sudden break. It was the slow, grinding force of one army refusing to yield. How long can men hold when the ground beneath them is turning to mud and blood? That answer was coming, but first, the lines had to break. And once they did, there would be no turning back. A battle does not end when the first man falls. It ends when the first line shatters. For hours, Lancaster's men had held the ridge, their formations bending but not breaking. But the storm, the blood loss, and the relentless pressure from Edward's advance were eating away at their resolve. York's soldiers fought like men who had burned their bridges. There was nowhere to retreat to, no safety waiting behind them. The moment came not with a roar, but with a sudden, almost imperceptible collapse. A section of Lancaster's front faltered, shields lowered for just a heartbeat too long. York's men surged into the gap, driving their blades through before the enemy could close ranks. Once a breach opens, it does not close. It widens like a wound. Panic spread faster than any command could counter. Orders were lost in the wind, drowned out by the screams of men crushed together in the press. Those at the back saw movement and thought it was a full retreat. Fear became fact in seconds. And in war, when one man runs, others follow. Edward's captains recognized the shift instantly. They pushed harder, pouring men into the breach. It was no longer two solid lines colliding. It was one line folding in on itself. The slope that had given Lancaster the advantage now became their prison, trapping them between the advancing Yorkists and the killing ground behind. Some fought on, swinging until their arms failed. Others dropped weapons and tried to flee, only to find their path cut off by their own fallen. The snow underfoot had turned to a slick red paste, making every step treacherous. This was where a soldier's will was tested, in the choice between standing in the press or turning your back to a blade. Edward himself pressed forward, his armor streaked with mud and blood, his voice carrying over the chaos. Every push brought him closer to the center of the field, closer to the moment when victory would tip beyond doubt. But he knew breaking the line was only the beginning. The slaughter was about to begin in earnest, and as the Yorkists poured through the breach, the battlefield began to flow toward the river. If you've stayed with me this far into the storm, you'll want to see what waits in the waters ahead, and you'll understand why this day would be remembered as England's bloodiest. Defeat drove them downhill, but the river stopped them cold. As Lancaster's line broke, the retreat turned into a stampede toward Beck, a narrow river swollen with meltwater and snow. Men stumbled down the slope, their breath ragged, the roar of pursuit in their ears. Some threw shields aside to run faster. Others still clutched their swords, too dazed to realize the fight had already left them. The first to reach the bank found no salvation. The water was icy, churning fast, the far side slick with mud. Armor dragged at their limbs, pulling them down before they could climb out. Those who hesitated were cut down from behind, the Yorkists driving hard to keep the pressure. In that moment, the river was not an escape. It was a trap. Bodies began to pile in the shallows. The weight of the fallen formed a grim bridge, and men scrambled over the dead in desperate bids to cross. Some made it halfway before an arrow found their back, sending them tumbling into the current. Others slipped on the blood-slick stones, dragged under by the hands of drowning comrades, clutching at anything to stay afloat. Edward's men showed no mercy. They knew a fleeing army could rise again. Only the dead stayed silent. Every swing, every thrust was made to finish what the snowstorm had started. The water turned a deep, sluggish red, foam and blood mixing in the eddies. Here, the cold was as deadly as the steel. The noise was unlike the clash of battle. It was chaos stripped to its rawest form. Shouts blurred into screams, steel into splashes. The living trampled the dying pulled the living down with them. And the river, indifferent to crown or cause, swallowed them all the same. By the time the current began to clear, the banks were lined with frozen corpses, some locked in the same grip they had in life, not as friends, but as enemies meeting the same end. Behind them, the battlefield lay quieting, but the storm had not yet passed. When the killing stops, the noise doesn't fade. It changes. The clash of steel gave way to the groan of the wounded, the crunch of boots over snow packed with bodies. The storm still blew across Towton, but now its howl seemed to carry the voices of those who would never leave the field. Edward's men moved among the fallen, searching for survivors, finishing those too far gone to save. For many, mercy and death came in the same stroke. The battlefield stretched into the white distance, littered with broken standards and shields half buried in snow. Helmets lay where heads had once been. Horses stood riderless, their flanks streaked with blood, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. This was the cost of a single day's victory, and no crown could make it lighter. Some soldiers stared in silence, their blades still in hand, as if expecting another charge. Others knelt beside the dead, searching for faces they recognized. A few found them. One man wept openly as he pulled the body of his own brother from the heap, the two wearing different colors but the same family crest. The snow began to fall again, softer now, covering red with white. It was as if the land itself was trying to forget what had been done here, but the survivors could not. Every step away from Towton carried the weight of what they had seen and what they had done. Was this peace or simply the pause before the next killing? Edward had the field, and soon he would have the throne. But even in triumph, the air around him was heavy with something colder than the storm. The knowledge that power won in blood must be held in blood. And so, as the dead were left to the snow, the living turned south, toward a coronation that would be crowned in shadow. Victory is heavy, heavier than armor, heavier than a crown. When Edward entered London in the days after Towton, the cheers were loud, but the streets still smelled of fear. News of the battle had traveled faster than his army, and every voice shouting his name carried the unspoken knowledge of how he had claimed it. In the eyes of many, he was the savior of the realm. In the eyes of others, the young butcher who had drowned the kingdom's heart in blood. The city's lords bent the knee, some with genuine loyalty, others with the careful smiles of men who knew resistance was useless. Edward read both kinds well. He had learned at Towton that power was not just taken on the field. It had to be held in every hall, at every table. The coronation was grand, but there was a coldness to it. The gold and jewels glinted under candlelight, yet the weight on his head was not the crown's metal, but the memory of the snow and the dead. He did not speak of Towton, but everyone in the hall knew that the crown he now wore had been forged in that storm. Margaret of Anjou was gone from the capital, yet her shadow still stretched over the court. Her surviving allies lingered like embers in a dying fire. Quiet for now, but ready to burn again. Edward's advisors urged him to secure his position quickly, to reward loyalty and punish hesitation. He nodded, but he was already thinking further ahead. A throne won by force invites force in return. Even as the celebration swelled, Edward kept his armor close. He had seen how quickly fortune could turn, how a crown could sit steady one day and tumble into the snow the next. For all its glitter, this was a crown of ice. Beautiful, dangerous, and liable to melt if he did not keep the kingdom frozen under his rule. And while he sat in Westminster, the ruins of the Lancaster cause smoldered in the north, waiting for the next breath of war. Defeat on the field is one thing. Defeat in the mind is another and far harder to recover from. After Towton, the House of Lancaster was no longer an army. It was a scattering of frightened men clutching at whatever scraps of safety they could find. Those who escaped the battlefield fled north into hostile country, knowing that every village could hold Yorkist patrols. Some disguised themselves as farmers. Some vanished into monasteries. Others simply kept walking until their feet bled. Margaret of Anjou retreated into exile, but not into surrender. She sought refuge and allies across the sea, promising revenge and the restoration of her husband's crown. Yet with each passing month, her cause bled supporters. Nobles who had sworn to Lancaster began to weigh the cost of loyalty against the certainty of York's new power. In war, survival often demands silence, and silence is the death of a cause. Henry VI, the king they fought for, was little more than a figurehead now. Rumors spread of his fragile mind breaking further under the weight of loss. His absence from the field at Towton became a symbol of Lancaster's weakness. A king who could not fight for his throne could not inspire others to risk their lives for it. In the north, pockets of resistance clung on, raiding Yorkist supply lines, ambushing small detachments. But these were sparks, not flames. Edward's control grew each week, his garrisons pressing deeper into Lancaster territory. Villages once loyal to the Red Rose began flying the white out of self-preservation. And yet, under the quiet, hatred still smoldered. Families who had lost fathers and sons at Towton did not forget. Exiles dreamed of returning. Could such wounds ever truly heal? Or would they fester until the roses bloomed red again? For now, Lancaster's ruin seemed complete. Its leaders scattered, its armies shattered, its hope buried under the snow at Towton. But England's history had never been one of final endings, and the Crown-Edward War would always rest uneasy, as long as even one enemy still drew breath. Before Towton, the war between Lancaster and York was still a question, a struggle of claims, of words, of maneuver. After Towton, it was an answer written in snow and blood. Edward gained a crown, a kingdom, and a place in history, but he also inherited the weight of every man who had fallen to give him that throne. The House of Lancaster lost its grip on power, but not its will to survive. Families were broken, loyalties shattered, villages scarred for generations. Victory had changed the map of England, yet it had also left wounds too deep for time to easily close. Power had been won, but at a price that could never truly be paid. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder, was the crown worth the river of lives it took to keep it from slipping away? If you've journeyed with me through this storm of history, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the darkest, most brutal chapters of the medieval world, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. You can also watch more tales like this in our playlist, Medieval History, The Darkest Medieval Tales, where every crown comes with its own shadow. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.